just told Camilla she can run the questions however she might like.
She said she can see the chat box, so
Yeah, yeah. Maybe I can sit over there.
You can use your mobile.
I can.
Normally we're strapped in. Cords and.
So Aaron, you want to run this? No, if we slide our tables like this way.
There you go.
See, there's my mug. Whoa! It's not going to get on the basketball court.
I can just do roll call and then.
Yes. You know, I have.
Trade Center on that screen too.
You'll have to post this as we go along. Mike Commodore doing a hell of a job, I see.
Yes.
Oh, really? I gotta drink more coffee.
She spends her days over my shoulder, so she gets a lot of coffee breaks.
Yeah. Coffee break is I didn't realize how old the roll up the rim contest was. Like it was around since the 1980s.
Really?
Yeah. It was on, you know that CB Age of Persuasion marketing. So he talked about the origins of roll up the rim, and it was initiated through the cup company that said we could do this for you, and you could run like a little contest under the rim. So it became so popular that it took within 5 years they were offering the cards because they didn't need to just stop at coffees and donuts.
Well, welcome everybody to our March 1st LTAD lunch session. We're very lucky to have Dr. Camilla Knight with us from Swansea University overseas. Hi, Camilla. Hi. We're going to continue on with our discussion with positive parenting in sport. It's been an encouraging one. We've been doing this for about 4 or 5 months now.
Yeah.
In respect to some of the stuff that's going on at the local level, we've seen in the Edmonton Journal and some other things going on in the Greater Toronto area, that this continues to be an issue. So this is fantastic to have Camilla here. So to get started, what we'll do is a quick roll call with everybody who we got in Calgary and then Edmonton, and then everybody that's on virtual. If you can just type in the chat box. If you don't have audio, let us know who you are and where you're at and what organization you're from before we get started. We'll start with let's start with Edmonton. We'll start over here.
Lindsay Curling.
Lindsay with curling.
Alex with Lysine Society.
Sebastian with the Alberta Triathlon Association.
I'm Taylor with Football Over.
George Mulligan with the Edmonton Sport Council.
Diane Gunn, Rhythmic Gymnastics, Alberta.
Steve Sir with Basketball Alberta.
Vicky Harbour, Sport for Life. Robin Gillespie, I'm a practicum student with Alberta Sport.
And Aaron with Alberta Sport. Can everybody hear us okay? Awesome. Good. How about Calgary?
Reed Bilden with the Alberta Sport Development Center. Lynn Job with Active for Life. Hi, Megan McKinley with the Be Fit for Life Network. And Leah Weens with Sport for Life and Repsol Sports Center. And just coming into the room, Sport Calgary.
Awesome.
And that's it. We may have a couple more trickling in, but right now, that's our group.
Fantastic. And on chat box, we have Claudio Berto with Alberta Masters Ski Club, Chuck Lee with Alberta Whitewater, Jason Sostrom with CSI Calgary, and a couple of others. Fantastic. If we can have, awesome. Let's get started. Vicky, do you want to take us away with our introduction with our guest speaker?
I know. Well, I've been talking about Camilla for a number of months, but I've known Camilla for a few years. Camilla completed her PhD under the supervision of Nick Holt at the University of Alberta around the positive youth development, and I was very, very fortunate to be on Camilla's comprehensive examining committee, and I think that was truly the time when you rocked my world, Camilla. Her understanding and presentation around a very different mindset around what's going on with parents in sport. And so I stayed in touch with Camilla because she was one of these individuals who's sharp as a whip. And it's one of those mixed feelings. I'm delighted about your position in Swansea, and I know Sport Wales, who Camilla currently does work with as well, is doing marvelous work with Sport Wales and other places around the UK. Camilla, I know your sport background is tennis.
Yep.
Ferocious player, which she maintained as a graduate student. And I think I want to leave it there because I want to give most time to you. But Camilla, if there are other pieces around that you would like to add to that, please feel free to do so.
All right, thank you. Thank you for the introduction, Vicky. It's the best one I've ever had, I think. Do you want me to go ahead?
I would, and I've given Camilla complete permission around, she's got some slides, but as far as she wanted this to be very interactive, I've informed Camilla about the last 2 sessions that we've been using the previous content from your webinar around promoting positive parenting. So not to say, there might be newcomers here as well, but Camilla, it's really yours, and I'm going to let you direct if you want people to ask questions as you go, or if you would like to create those break or pause moments for questions. It's completely up to you.
Okay, perfect. So I do have some slides. I and ahed about having slides and whether that was the best thing to do, but what I wanted to do was give you really a background into the approach I take, because until you really understand the approach I take to it, some of it might seem a little bit unhelpful, potentially. So I'm going to pull the slides up. I can see the chat box if people want to write questions or send questions along. I'm more than happy to do that, but my slides will only take maybe 15-20 minutes, if that, and then hopefully we can get into some discussion. There's a few different initiatives happening at the moment which I think are really interesting around parenting, which would be good to talk about, but mostly I want to share some of my very applied experiences. So right now we are developing and delivering sort of parent support workshops, and some of them are going terribly and some of them are going really well. So I'm happy to discuss those as well. I will just pull up my slides here though. So I guess the first thing to start with is the idea that my approach to considering parenting and where it's really come in from and why maybe it's a little bit different to the traditional approach to parenting is that I try and look at it from a broader cultural perspective and try and understand, what are the perceptions around parenting, what are the expectations we have, and in my mind, how are parents in sport really being misrepresented? And that's what sort of underpins my approach to try and, I guess what I call change the conversation around parents and really try and push organizations and push clubs to think about, how we're positioning parents and what the impact of that is. You've seen me, so I don't actually know why I put a picture on the slide. So as Vicky said, I'm at Swansea University. I've been here now coming up 4 years, so it's scary to think it's almost 4 years ago that I left Edmonton because I still miss it most days. But it's been a really exciting time since I came to Swansea. So Vicky mentioned that I do some work with Sport Wales, and I do. So we have it's called the Welsh Institute of Performance Science, which is a group of academics who lead sort of specific research projects for Sport Wales. And Sport Wales is sort of the overall governing body for all of the sports located within Wales. Very similar to the English Institute of Sport, but much smaller. The other area that I work in, the area I most enjoy working because it allows me to really push my parenting work, is through the Child Protection in Sport unit. And I saw that Vicky shared some of the videos that I had done and the webinar that Vicky's talked about. That was all tied into the Child Protection in Sport unit's Parents in Sport Week initiative. And that was an initiative really about this idea of changing the conversation around parents. And we're just evaluating it at the moment, and yeah, it's mixed. Some people completely missed the message, some people were on message, but this is going to be an annual event that we're looking at rolling out, and we are looking at potentially making it international. So if you would be keen on sort of developing sort of any work around that, then that would be great. Leah, I've just got a question from you come up about making the slides full screen. I have now. Are they now full screen on your screens? Can people see the screens?
We have at the top the three camera. Oh, yourself.
Sorry guys. We have the three images of the video, the cameras at the top, so it's making the screen smaller at the bottom. So maybe we just need to shut off our camera sharing while Camilla's presenting, like our webcam, and then we'll be able to see full screen, like a bigger.
You can adjust the size of the boxes.
Oh, okay. Okay, we'll figure it out.
Okay.
We have Megan here, so we'll figure it out. Thank you. All right, continue on.
Okay, perfect. And so in terms of my background and the research I've been doing here, scarily I've now been looking at parents and sport for 10 years, which really means I should have probably published more, but I haven't. But no, so 10 years I've been looking at this, and over that time I've really looked at kind of trying to construct these ideas all together. And what I want to share with you right now is really just my thoughts, a collection of my thoughts around how I think we should be best going about kind of trying to enhance parental involvement, and it does tie into the recent banning of parents by Edmonton Hockey. So I'll discuss that as we go through. Those of you who have, oh, hang on, sorry, something's now gone along with. There we go. Those of you who've seen the webinar that I did will have seen these slides before, but for me the most important thing as soon as we start talking about parents is really just understanding that they are critical. So as soon as we talk about parents, I get kind of irritated that they're presented in a negative light, because without parents sport really wouldn't happen. And I think one of the tensions for me that exists between organizations and clubs and coaches and parents is the idea of who's doing who a favor, I guess. So this idea that maybe clubs and sports, and definitely some coaches, feel like they're doing parents a favor by offering an opportunity for children to be involved in sport. And I would possibly, maybe to be controversial, put it out there that, you know, parents are doing clubs and organizations a favor too by allowing their children to join them. And I think if we can start to negotiate some of the tension around what is the role of parents, and are we recognizing the role of parents, and that's really sort of an important place to start, because without parents, sport really wouldn't exist. Sadly, and I do say this, and I mean it when I say sadly, I think that the media is causing a lot of problems when we start to think about parents' involvement in sports. We know that the media like to sensationalize things, but unfortunately, at least to my reading, and it may be different in Canada, but I think it's probably the same from what I remember. The parents who are hitting the headlines are the parents who are getting it wrong, the parents who are making the mistakes, when we know that millions of parents are getting it right around the world all of the time. And what we're seeing in our research now, unfortunately, is because of these headlines that are coming out around parents are becoming increasingly anxious about having children involved in sport, and parents are also becoming anxious about their own involvement in sport. And as you'll see a little bit later on, as there's more stress associated with sport, we start to see more of the negative behaviors coming out from parents. So I think we've sort of found ourselves in this cycle now where there's a representation of parents that's negative, and now parents are sort of reacting to that, and it's almost reinforcing some of those negative stereotypes. And this is obviously the incident that has been in the headlines very recently in Edmonton, which Vicky very kindly sent to me, but also got sent to me from many, many people. So obviously a lot of people know this is an area of interest to me. And I'm very interested to sort of have some discussion around this in the future in this sort of chat time. But for me, it's a concern, and I'll leave it like that, and we can have some discussion later on once I've put my position forward as to why it might be concerning. And part of the issue that we have is obviously not only are the media portraying parents very negatively, but coaches often portray parents very negatively, and often inadvertently, I think. I do appreciate that parents cause a lot of issues for coaches, but I think that probably we know that many of the parents aren't doing it. But I think where we're now in a position is that the language that's associated with parents is so negative and so reinforcing of this negative message, that lots of coaches, new coaches coming into the sport, are sort of hesitant around engaging with them. And if I was to give an example of this, I'm embedded in a sports academy here in the UK, and my sole aim with that academy is to work on sports psychology, but particularly to develop a parents initiative and develop the work that we're doing with parents. And from the minute I arrived at the academy, all I've heard about is how many issues there are with parents. Even when the coaches think they're being positive around the parents, they're being critical, and they very much are being portrayed as something to be dealt with, rather than people who can be worked with to try and facilitate a very positive sporting environment. Interestingly, we recently had a survey out around Parents in Sport Week in the UK, and one of my questions was around the messaging around parents, and a number of the respondents who were from sports organisations actually made a comment that a lot of the questions were around semantics, and just talking about, just different representations in language. But for me, the language that we use around parents is really, really important. So whilst some people might think it's semantics from a sports psychology perspective, we know the language and the way we're representing parents is really important to consider. The big issue that we do have, and I put my hands up to this, is that whilst we have an idea and we have an understanding that parents are, really getting it wrong sometimes, we don't have great literature or great research around why. We have the traditional standard reasons for the arguments of parents looking for a return on investment, And one of the things that, again, around that language is this idea of whether we should even discuss parents investing in sport. As soon as you start to use the term investment, it implies that there's going to be something coming back as a result, and usually that is a performance. And I just had a very, very exciting meeting with a number of sports psychologists from around Europe, and we actually decided we're never going to use the word investment with parents again. We've decided that it's associated with too many negative connotations because of the financial sort of perception. We also know that a lot of people argue that the issues from parents is because they're projecting their fulfillment wishes, or they were failed athletes, so now they've got to see this in their children, or they're really pushing them to do something that they weren't able to do. And then we also have sort of more of a sociological explanation that within society, parents are now being judged based on how successful their children are. So we have a few different arguments for why parents might be acting in the way they do, and it's really, really, really easy for people to jump to the investment and the money, but we actually don't know that. But if you were to talk to sports coaches and you were to talk to sports organizations, often they'd be very confident in saying that that is the reason. And again, I would say that that's tied into this negative portrayal and this negative perception of parents. Because what we do know is that what people then respond to is, all right, well, if parents are acting in this way because of these experiences or this expectation of something, or a response to money invested, or a response to trying to make their child be something that they weren't, the response becomes very much education focused. So it makes the assumption that parents just don't realize, or they don't know that what they're doing is wrong, and really all we need to do is educate them and tell them what you're doing is wrong, you need to be better, fundamentally. And that sort of ties into the response from Edmonton Hockey around codes of conduct and also banning people. It gives an impression that your behaviors are wrong, you either don't know it, and so we need to teach you about it, or you do know it and you're still doing it wrong. So it's very much an education kind of response. The evidence for the success of these is questionable. We don't have the strongest scientific literature base on which to judge whether education programs work. What we do know is that education programs annoy parents. We do know that parents don't feel that they should have to be educated about being a parent, and it comes back to this idea of who knows children better than the parents themselves. But we also know that education programs, or these sort of codes of conduct approaches to working with parents, don't tend to hit the parents who need them. So the parents who are good and the parents who are sort of on board and know what they're trying to achieve and have good control over their emotions tend to be the people who buy into these programs the best, and they're not necessarily the people that they need to be targeted at. One of the initiatives that you may or may not have seen that's doing the rounds right now in Australia is the Let Kids Be Kids initiative. If I click this link, I'm hoping it's going to show my screen still. Okay, here we go. So apologies now, because now it's not going to be full screen. But this is the new initiative that they're using in Australia. All about Let Kids Be Kids, and they have videos and they have infographics and they have articles you can use and all sorts of things which people may find helpful. But the focus of this, as you can see in this tagline at the bottom here, is very much around stopping poor sideline behavior. And this approach is again looking at, if we highlight what parents are doing wrong, they'll be able to change it. I guess the issue that I take with this is it's very negative around parents, but it also assumes that it's as simple as telling people they're doing things wrong and they'll be able to change. And we know that that's not the case when you start looking at some of the behavior change literature. Oh, sorry, wrong view. But there are some interesting resources there if people are interested in them. What we do know, what we do actually have better evidence for, is understanding that if we can understand parents' experiences, and if parents themselves are having better experiences within the sports, then they are better involved and better engaged with their children. That, however, and I may be speaking very much out of turn because I know that obviously I'm talking to a number of sports organizations. That approach, however, I don't think clubs and organizations embrace quite so rapidly because it puts the emphasis not so much on parents but on clubs and organizations to be considering the work and the environment that's being created for parents. What we do know is that the youth sport context is increasingly complicated. We know that it's very professionalized, or many organizations are now very professionalized. Young children are being treated like professional athletes, and with that there comes a lot of pressures and a lot of expectations. If you create a professional environment, the response from parents is that it will be a professional environment, and therefore it comes with certain expectations. Whether those are right or wrong, we know that the more professionalized the environment that children come into, often the higher the expectations from parents. There's increasingly high expectations of parents within society, and those expectations tend to be associated with, again, probably not appropriately, but this is the situation we're in, where parents are being expected to create very structured environments where their children are in adult organized activities. There's a whole bunch of literature that says that that's not what we want them to be doing, but that is currently the pressures that are being put on parents. Increasingly, obviously, there's the lure of the professional career, and the standing of professional athletes within society is becoming increasingly apparent, so obviously there's that added element. There's a complete misunderstanding of talent development tied into obviously this idea that, as I'm sure all of you in the rooms know, you know, we want children in multi-sports, we don't want them specializing early, yet as many times as we tell parents this, they go to clubs and they get very different messages. So we've got competing messages there. As clubs become more private, trying to get more money for children being involved, they're increasingly encouraging them to come in earlier and earlier. And consequently, from a very young age, we now have parents making a substantial financial and time commitment. So this is now the culture, or this is now the context of youth sports. So this is what parents are up against. And I'm not a parent, and I should have probably started with that. But I've worked in enough sports organizations to know that they are incredibly stressful, and the environments that I work in, information's coming out last minute, things are scheduled at really inconvenient times, there seems to be an idea that parents can just drop things at the, you know, as soon as people want them, and they can be here, there and everywhere, and they can leave work early, and they don't have other children, and, you know, everything is around the sport. So having been in that environment enough, I can start to get an appreciation of maybe why parents aren't always sort of on board or reacting in the ways that we would, whether it's in relation to training or to competitions. So when we take that context and we start to look at some of the responses and some of the issues that we have around parents, we know that one of the main issues, and I think completely understandably, and I'm sure many of you are parents, so have sort of had this experience, it's around empathy. You know, parents are sitting there in a situation where they never normally get an opportunity to see their children trying to compete or trying to excel. We don't sit there and watch children do their maths exams. We don't sit there and watch them, you know, do class tests, but we sit there and watch them try and compete in sport. And what we know from parents is this real issue around empathy and wanting to be able to, you know, make sure that their children are happy, and that then comes out sometimes in the less appropriate sort of manners. And one of the things that I've really found apparent when I talk to parents is, because they feel for their kids and because they know that their kids are having a challenging time, it's not so much just sitting there watching them that's really challenging, but as they're sitting there watching them and knowing that they're then going to have to be the ones who sort of put them back together at the end of the game is particularly challenging for parents themselves. We also know that it's, as I've sort of alluded to, and I've been building to this point, it's a really, really stressful environment for parents. And when we talk about the stresses within youth sport, it's really easy to get stuck on what's going on at competition and then seeing the reactions of parents when they're on the sidelines. But actually, that's not where parents have the biggest impact on children. It's their engagement with children around sport at home and their engagement with children around sport at training that we know can have a bigger impact. So we need to consider not just those demands at competitions and those responses, but the demands more broadly. And when we talk to parents, they do talk about the competition demands, and they talk about very much the stress of watching their children compete and worrying that they're not going to perform all that well. But they mostly focus on what we classify as the organizational stresses, the cost of sports, the timings of sports, the guilt associated with not being around for siblings, the issues of coaches not feeding back to them, the issues of, for example, talent ID camps happening and that information not coming back to them as parents. So these organizational issues, and information coming out last minute, lack of information, those really cause parents to have huge degrees of stress, and that stress then carries through into the first opportunity they have to engage with a coach, or they see their child then not perform well and they've managed all this stress for a long period of time, and that's where we then see the reaction. And then there's also all the stress that's associated with just being a parent and being concerned about your child's development. And this is where I think some of the issues come in around this idea that parents are pushing their children to succeed in sport, but actually when we talk to parents, what they talk about is this big challenge around trying to make the right decisions and worrying, do I take them out of school, do I keep them in school, do I put them in summer hockey, don't I put them in summer hockey, and trying to make these decisions often with very little information beyond a coach who obviously has their own vested interest in what children might do depending on money and performance and things. And these developmental concerns are really, really strong for parents, and that's why you might start to see them sort of questioning decisions and questioning sort of decisions of coaches. When we look specifically at competitions, this is taken actually from one of the studies I did for my PhD, and it's specifically around tennis, but we've started to see it being replicated in other organizations. First and foremost, parents' experiences are very much dictated by children's experiences. So if we can make an experience better for children, for instance, if we can help children to better manage their emotions, work better with their teammates, look like they're enjoying themselves more often, we know that that's going to have an impact on parents' experiences and consequently parents' behaviors. We also know that there's a huge issue for parents around sportspersonship, and if they perceive that there's any issues around sort of sportspersonship, cheating, referees not necessarily seeing things that are going on within games, then that's obviously going to have an impact on parents' experiences, and as soon as parents having negative experiences, that's when it starts to kind of impact on children. Issues around parent-parent interactions are sort of, I think, ones that most people can appreciate, but then also just how competitions are developed and how much emphasis is put on rankings or how much emphasis is put on winning and this focus there. So there's obviously a number of sort of concerns and issues which are impacting on what parents are experiencing and consequently what they're able to achieve. What they're doing in terms of reacting to their children when their children do or don't achieve. And then very finally, and this ties into the point that I made earlier around the organization of sport now and the culture that we're in, what we're actually seeing from our research is that as much as we like to blame parents, or I don't like to blame parents, people like to blame parents for their behaviors, what we're actually seeing is that parents are very much becoming a product of the culture in which their children are situated. So there's research that's come out of Australian swimming, there's research that's come out of football in the UK, and what we're seeing is that there's this culture being created. Maybe it's around expectations for performance, maybe it's around how athletes train, how they look, really being an elite athlete from a young age, and parents are taking that on, but parents don't understand necessarily the confines of it. So people are creating this culture, this environment which is placing high expectations and really pushing certain areas and parents are just running with them to extremes. So we need to be really conscious of the cultures that we're creating and how that message around that culture is then communicated to their parents. So we have lots of good things happening, and lots of people like to sum them up with these sorts of signs that are put up to try and cue parents into behaving appropriately or reacting appropriately. But my argument would be, and it ties in the same sort of code of conducts, etc., is when you think back through the ideas that I've just presented to you and think about sort of some of the complexity of the situations that we're dealing with, if the only response that we have to this is to put signs up, is to put code of conducts up, is to really just put it back on the parent, we're never going to be in a position where we start to really solve the issues. I do appreciate, however, that it's much harder to start to change an entire sporting culture than it is to try and change one parent's behavior. But when we start drawing on any behavior change literature, the evidence would overwhelmingly be that we need to consider this broader kind of climate and context as well as individuals' behaviors. So my challenge to everyone that I speak to, my challenge to myself on a daily basis is really, how do we go about changing the conversation when we're talking about parents, and how do we go about sort of repositioning, you know, what the work that we're doing and what we're trying to achieve. And my first and foremost sort of approach is adopting what we in sports psychology would call a humanistic approach, you know, recognizing that parents are humans, that they're managing children and work and these demands and all of these kind of issues that are going on within general life, and you know, recognize that we're not dealing with people who are just there as a parent of a young athlete, but they have a lot going on that they're trying to manage. And really trying to get coaches particularly to recognize parents as a valued social support resource. What we have is considerable evidence that shows that athletes are heavily reliant on their parents in a number of different situations to provide them with social support, be it to cope with stress associated with sport, bullying, safeguarding, all of these sorts of things. And as soon as our reaction is to take parents out of the situation, whether it's to ban them from competitions, ban them from watching training, we're straight away creating the potential issue for parents, for athletes, of removing a key resource for them. Whether we believe that resource is appropriate or not, they are usually the people that the athletes turn to. So we do need to start to recognize why parents are important and what they're bringing. And we really need to start adopting much more of a collaborative approach to working with parents and helping parents understand what they can bring to the situation. For me, this is often summed up by trying to contrast the views or the experiences of coaches and parents, and it's something that we've done in a number of pieces of work that we've got ongoing. We talk to a coach, and there, you know, in this instance here, you've got, you know, this coach talking about this parent, about how this parent's always just there on the sidelines, never leaves. I don't think it's healthy for the child. But then you've got the mother explaining this situation of, you know, I only have my child really for 10 years involved in sport, and I love them, and I want to see them, and I want to have that, make the most of the experience of being with them. And as soon as you start to realize, you know, that we have to understand both sides of this, and maybe neither of them is exactly right, then you can start to kind of approach parents and parental involvement in a bit of a different way. Because really, when we're talking about parents, parents are trying to manage being a parent, society's expectations and perceptions of being a parent, media portrayals of being a parent, organizers, whether that's clubs, like tournament referees, competition referees, all of the needs and requirements of, you know, you've got to be on time and you've got to be behaving appropriately. They've got to manage the expectations and the needs of coaches and what coaches are wanting from the athletes, and then also they've got to manage, you know, the demands and the expectations and the requirements that are coming to them from their children as well. So as soon as you start to really try and consider all of these different factors that they're impacting on parents, I hope you start to see why I try and move away from this idea that we've got to just tell parents what's right and what's wrong, and we've actually got to start considering how we can go about changing the environment that parents are finding themselves in. And fundamentally, all of this comes together for me under this idea around value. I've been in jobs where I don't necessarily feel 100% valued. I'm sure many of you have been in situations where you haven't been valued for your engagement or your input. And when we talk to parents, they almost overwhelmingly feel undervalued for what they're doing in terms of supporting their children in sport. And we know that when people don't feel valued, you don't get the very best out of them. And so for me, that's really the main takeaway from the work that I've been doing, is about how can we change the conversation so that parents do feel valued within their organizations and within their clubs, so that you can really use them as a resource to help children have the very best experiences. And that took a little bit longer than anticipated, but that's where I'm at with my work and with sort of my background. And so I'm really open now to people's feedback, people's thoughts, feel free to reject it entirely, and I'll try and defend myself as best I can.
Go ahead.
Well, first things first, thank you very much. This is for me, it's with all our session discussion, this has certainly been a refreshing approach. Changing the culture rather than trying to band-aid everything is what we try to do, is what kind of sometimes our capacity allows us to do. Yeah, code of conduct this, other things like respect in sport. And I think as professionals within the industry, I think we're starting to question some of those strategies. And certainly this is a complete paradigm shift in thinking, and certainly appreciative on my end.
That's good. I'm glad to see that I got a positive response.
Yeah, and if and likewise, Camilla, that was really good. I mean, I've got a few things in the hopper, but I'd certainly like to just open it up to Leah, your group, either remotely, this room. What do you want to put Leah, if you've got questions you want to put in the chat box, or if people have questions to ask in here?
Comment from Jason, a great perspective. Thanks for researching on this. That's in the chat box.
And I'm
Big Lane has a comment here in Calgary.
Okay.
Actually, it's a question. We talk a lot about parent education, and when I say that, I think of helping parents to understand long-term athlete development and how that can help them make decisions for their child's development through sport. It'd be nice if we had a different word for that kind of parent education, and the kind of parent education, if I was understanding Camilla correctly, she's talking more about code of conduct and more negatively oriented education vehicles. Does that make sense?
It makes 100% sense to me, and in fact, we tend to call them parent support sessions. So our sessions that are around providing parents with information so that they can make good decisions and really help their children succeed, we tend to term parent support, and that's been more widely accepted by parents, because that's really the intent, and for me that is the intent of those sessions. We're trying to support them by giving them information, which I think is what you're talking about there in terms of the LTAD kind of information and that sort of thing. And when we talk to parents, so I spend a lot of time asking parents what information do they need, and they want information. Like, they really do want information, but they don't want to feel like they're going to have to come into a room and be told how to parent. And so that's very much where we've kind of started to go with the idea around parent support. I don't know if anyone has a better word, but that's currently what we're badging it as.
That's very helpful, thanks.
If I can just add to that, then I hear you around parents don't want to be told how to parent. And yet, if the behaviors that are emerging start to encroach on disrespectful behavior, how do you disentangle that? Because again, coaches don't want to be told how to coach either. And in fact, we were having this discussion in the room just yesterday. So what's your thought on that or experience around that?
So I have a go-to sort of task that I try to use, and it sort of depends on where you're at in terms of with the relationship between parents and coaches and that sort of thing. But when I do work with parents, it's almost always interactive. And one of the things that I find works really, really well around sort of behaviors, without it being termed behaviors, is we talk about role responsibilities. And I write a whole lot of cards, like everything you can think of, from who should shout at kids, which I'm not advocating, but I always put some in there that shouldn't really be in there, to who should be clapping, who's responsible for cleaning the kit, who should take the kids out for ice cream. All of these roles, we put them in a big table in the middle. We have big posters where you stick the roles, and you have a coach here and a parent here and an athlete here. And certain ones get allocated out very easily, and certain ones become very important discussion points. And that's how I go about trying to have those conversations then around those behaviors. So rather than it being this behavior is unacceptable, and I obviously there's a line that you've got to draw in terms of what is acceptable, and I work with a child protection in sport unit, so there's definitely behaviors that are unacceptable, but there's certain behaviors in terms of you know, what information's being portrayed on the sidelines and how people are sort of shouting or, you know, cheering for their kids, actually need to be discussed, I think, rather than there being an absolute, you cannot say this, because what we do know is that how people parent in different societies varies, and we know there's a huge cultural component to parenting. And what we tend to do, at least in the UK and the US, I don't want to put it on Canada as well because you tend to be much better at these sorts of things than us, is we tend to impose a very Western approach on how you should parent on the sidelines. And that can cause some issues because there are different ways of parenting. So what I found the most successful is really writing down all these different behaviors and leading to some discussion. If that's not going to work, I try to use kids. So I try to talk to the players themselves or other players. I have a bank of quotes, and I very much portray, you know, this is how a child's feeling when they're seeing this behavior. And that tends to be a pretty nice way of hitting some parents. My concern, as soon as you start to just try and educate parents and say this is inappropriate sideline behaviors, comes back to the point I said before, those parents who need to hear that won't be there. But actually, if you have a very interactive session that's around discussing roles and responsibilities, and it's early on in the season and it's maybe a mandatory session for everyone to come to, you can have an open conversation that's, in my experience, much more effective.
Yeah. No, that, and I love the idea of getting them engaged first and foremost, and then allowing room for discussion on those between the edges of one or the other, and certainly open for discussion. And
and I think what we do find is that often there is parents think that they're meant to do certain things, or they should do certain things, or certain things are okay, and coaches think that these fall into their remit or they don't want them, and they're just never discussed. Because there's sort of an assumption that people know. And for me, some of that then also comes down to, if a coach is saying this is how it is, or a parent is saying this is how it is, then at least you have that conversation earlier, and you can start to make the decision as to whether this is the right club for you to engage with. I've had a couple of questions that have come up on this chat thing that I've just realized I've missed, so apologies to those of you who's put them. Jason has asked about coaches' egos and coaches' egos and how the program will coach communication about program goals to parents. So a few things that I think coaches' egos, if I'm reading that in the right way, around the emphasis on winning and results and how that might play back on the coach themselves. Again, I think that's something that has to get addressed early on in terms of what is the philosophy of the club and what is the philosophy of that coach. But then, and this is where it does become tricky, parents need to be able to hold coaches accountable to that philosophy. So what we know is that coaches have coaching philosophies because they have to have coaching philosophies, or it's encouraged that they have coaching philosophies. But then they say that they don't care about winning, and as soon as it gets near to playoff time, they really care about winning. And then they wonder why parents start to really care about winning, or they start to react inappropriately. And so in the same way as we're obviously seeing that's what's just happened in with Hockey Edmonton, parents are being held accountable. You know, it's whether within organizations it's feasible for coaches to be held accountable for not aligning appropriately with their philosophy. And I know that that's a tricky one to address. And then we've had a comment from Claudio who said, interesting topic, and as coaches we're always trying different ways to engage parents. Sometimes the parents take the discussion further. I'm always trying to give them my expectation and try to match to their expectation, and it seems to soften the tough parent. And I would support that. That would be my my experience. And actually, to give you a really good example, so one of the clubs I work with was recently having reviews with parents and athletes, and one parent came in really, really upset, really irritated about a number of different things, and it got very heated, and I just happened to be sitting in the room. It got very heated between the coach and the parents. They diffused the situation, and it wasn't appropriate at that point for me to say anything, but the coach managed it, and then when the parent left, we sort of had a discussion about it, and I just said to the coach, I said, just out of interest, because he knew he had another challenging parent coming in, I said, start the conversation by thanking them for everything they do. Just start that conversation by saying, before we discuss the situation with your child, I just want to thank you for, you know, we appreciate how much you're doing and what you're doing, you know, and how much you invest in your son coming here, and completely different conversation, because straight away the parents were feeling like they were valued and that they were appreciated in that situation. So I'm not saying it's going to work with everyone, but that sort of engagement and recognition does seem to help. There's a question around how you might prevent recent incidents such as that occurred in Hockey Edmonton. I wish that I could say if you do this then sideline behaviours won't exist, but in my experience, unless we start building things in from early on in the season and really trying to make some change to that culture, these things are going to exist. We can't expect, no, I can't imagine that a parent stands on the sideline and thinks, today I'm going to have a fight, I'm going to engage really poorly at a children's youth sporting event. I just can't get my head around the fact that a parent would actively think that. So we know that it's a response to an environment. And until we start addressing that environment, we're going to struggle. And that needs to be done much earlier in the season. It needs to be around the philosophy that we're creating within the club. However, that said, there are some very, very short-term things that we know do help manage emotions on the sidelines. Giving parents specific roles and responsibilities can be really helpful, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to make the environment less emotional. You need to try and take some of the emotion out of it, and as soon as you distract people from doing that, you give them sort of a little avoidance techniques. So one of the things that we found worked very well with some Some clubs is giving parents specific things that they're looking for in the game. You're trying to keep track of these passes, or you're trying to keep track of this engagement and this response. Your job is to talk to this parent about this, and just giving little roles and responsibilities can be really helpful. But again, it's really hard to do that just when it gets to playoffs and when it gets really emotional. But I have to say I'm not a fan of anything that results in kids feeling like they're being punished for their parents' behaviors, because I don't personally think that parents can, and so that children should be in that situation. And that's, I guess, where the concerns for me come in terms of how we're starting to respond to some of the behaviors that we're seeing from parents.
Camilla, to a follow-up, it's great here in Calgary. Do we actually see evidence that there's more and more of this happening in youth sport, or is it just solely based on anecdotal evidence around media and things like that?
We don't have any evidence. We don't have good enough data to actually say this is increasing. People will sort of imply it is, but it's very anecdotal. There isn't actually hard evidence, but we don't really have good stats. But when we look at the research studies and we sort of map them, it doesn't seem like it's becoming more. I think it's just that people are more aware of it, and then generally kind of the amount of organized sport that's happening is more, so there's more opportunities. But I don't think that we really are seeing that much of a shift.
Thank you.
No problem. Any other questions? I've done all of the ones on the screen.
We've got about 5 minutes left. Any other comments? Questions?
Is there any data that's looked at the correlation between a parent's personal background and their attitudes and expectations and involvement?
We actually just did a study on this recently. In terms of background, we were interested in sort of their sporting experience, their expectations coming in, what their goals were, whether they'd had good sporting experiences, bad sporting experiences, and what we found were that, unsurprisingly, if parents had good experiences, then they had an expectation that their children were going to have good experiences, but the level to which they competed really dictated what roles they took on. And what we found really, really interesting were that those parents who had competed generally to a high level tried to not get involved in sort of any coaching and things, and they tended to stay out of it. And they did have high expectations in terms of what their children would take away from the experience. So not necessarily that their children would become elite athletes, but they held them to high standards in terms of improvement, learning life lessons, expecting coaches to engage in certain ways. In contrast, what we found were that parents who had not very good sporting experiences, who'd maybe been sat on the bench themselves, who maybe wouldn't class themselves as sporty, illustrated these really high levels of empathy with their children, and seemed to be the sort of parents who, if their children weren't being picked or they weren't having great games, might be the ones who would react in a very protective manner. And so consequently they often try to take on a lot of roles within their children's sport, but it was very clear that this seemed to be tied to this negative experience that they had. But also what we found were that there really were these groups, and it was really interesting just in terms of talking to the parents and trying to identify what their expectations were coming in. And again, I don't think that this is rocket science, but what became very clear were that what parents were expecting coming in differed considerably. And if we try and put on these generic sessions for parents, they're just not going to hit some parents, because that's not their reason for having their children involved. I can share that paper with Vicky, and Vicky, you're more than welcome to share with people if you would like.
Thank you, Camilla. That would be wonderful. That would be.
No.
And we have also circulated the website to your short clip videos, as well as, I know there's numerous resources on there, but are there any ones in particular that are shiny and ones that you really like to talk about or share?
Right now, there's no resource that I love, but especially not those videos because I make terrible faces in them. But we are currently in the process, and this isn't going to be an immediate response. I'm in the process of an 18-month grant with European project partners, and what we're going to be producing is a bank of resources for parents on all sorts of sort of areas, and we're going to draw together kind of best practice. So what I'm happy to do is, as we kind of pull those resources together, I'm happy to sort of send them over for you to do with whatever you would like.
That's great, and I know you were very kind in the beginning around because we've kind of tapped in, and I've actually stayed connected to your apron string since you've left Canada. But if there are, I don't know, there's an incredibly awesome group of people involved in sport in this province. We've been working on a lot of issues around appropriate athlete development, meaningful competition, other aspects coming out of Canadian Sport for Life, improved relationships with OTP, to surprise you, all those kinds of things. So if there is something that would be mutually beneficial, I know there's people in this province that would be keen to follow up with some of those things without it being onerous to you, and vice versa. I think these kinds of conversations with people that really want to learn more and have these discussions, we'd love to continue this kind of connection with you, Camilla, as well as those relationships you're building.
Oh yeah, no, definitely, it would be, it would be great. And I'm actually just thinking, because I'm in Edmonton, not for a while, I'm over in December. So whether I'm hoping to be over for a couple of weeks, so whether there's an opportunity then to actually connect with people in person, if people wanted to, I'd be more than happy.
That's wonderful. That's very generous.
That's all right. I have lots of things to talk about. So people who are willing to talk to me about parents, I'm always happy to meet with. If anyone has anything else that they wanted to talk through, or I see Jason's asked for some examples, but I'm conscious it's now 8 o'clock for me, which means it must be the end of the time. Feel free to send me an email. Vicky has obviously all my details, so feel free to circulate those around, or if you've got specific situations that you want to talk to, please feel free to just get in touch. I'm more than happy to chat.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Great session today. A lot of positive discussion and certainly some things to follow up on, so fantastic.
Yep. Thank you so much, Camilla. And on behalf of the people calling in from Calgary, I know Leah and her crew down there send, you guys okay down there, Leah?
Yeah, we're great. Thank you very much.
Excellent. And I know to our remote callers again, thanks for calling in. And this was terrific, Camilla. I look forward to staying in touch, and we're certainly going to continue to use the great information that you're working hard on.
Great, and thank you for inviting me. It was fun to share.
Oh, love to have you here. Bye, Camilla.
All right. Bye. Bye.
See you.